flickering lights over the lake were still humming when my phone lit up with my mother's name, and I let it ring out twice before I answered, because 8 years of silence teaches you that the people who threw you away always come back when they smell money. But that's the end. Let me start where it actually started, which is the kitchen of a house in Toledo, Ohio, on a Sunday afternoon in late October, when I was 9 years old and learned exactly where I ranked in my own family. My name is Sadie Worthington. My mother, Renata, was throwing a graduation party that day. Not for me, I was 9, but for my older brother Dominic, who'd finished some accelerated thing at the community college. The kind of achievement that in our house got streamers and a sheet cake and 40 folding chairs borrowed from the church basement. I remember standing at the counter in a dress that pinched under the arms because it was last year's Easter dress, and I remember asking my mother if I could have a corner piece of the cake, the part with the blue frosting roses, and she looked at me the way you'd look at a stain on the carpet and said, "Those are for guests. There's bread in the pantry if you're hungry." I ate 2 slices of white bread standing at the counter, folded over so it looked like a sandwich, and nobody noticed, and that was the day I understood that, in the math of my family, I was the number you carried over and then forgot about. My father, Wendell, was at that party. He was at all of them. He stood by the grill in his good shirt, flipping burgers, nodding along to whatever my mother announced. And when I caught his eye, he gave me this small, tired smile that was supposed to mean something like, sorry. It never meant enough to actually do anything. That was my father's whole life. Sorry that fixed nothing. Sympathy with no spine behind it. He'd hand me a $5 bill behind the garage and whisper, "Don't tell your mother." Like the problem was secrecy and not the fact that his wife was starving the spirit out of his daughter while he flipped burgers. Dominic was the son the whole house orbited. He'd been a county wrestling champion in high school, and that medal hung in the front hall like a crucifix, and my mother told the story of his final match to anyone who'd hold still long enough. The takedown in the 3rd period, the ref raising his arm, the crowd. She told it so many times I could recite it. Meanwhile, I'd won the regional spelling bee in 5th grade, and the certificate stayed in my backpack for 3 weeks because there was no room on the wall and no interest in making any. I learned to disappear, which is its own kind of skill. I learned that if I asked for nothing, I got left alone, and being left alone was better than being noticed because being noticed meant being compared, and the comparison never went my way. I'd come home from school, microwave whatever was in the fridge, and go up to my room with library books. The Toledo Public Library was my real house. The librarian there, a woman named Imogen Frost who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, started setting aside books she thought I'd like. Not kid books, real ones, books about how things worked. She was the first adult who ever looked at me like I was a person with a future instead of a chore that hadn't been completed. But the one who actually changed my life was my great-aunt Marguerite. She was my father's aunt, technically a widow in her 70s who lived in a tidy little ranch house on the other side of the river, with a garden out back that she babied like it was made of glass. My mother couldn't stand her. Called her nosy, called her a busybody, rolled her eyes every time the woman's Buick pulled into the driveway uninvited. But Aunt Marguerite kept coming, and she kept doing this thing where she'd find me. At the edge of a party, on the porch steps, in the kitchen, eating my bread sandwich, and she'd sit down next to me like I was the most interesting person there. "What are you reading these days, Sadie girl?" she'd ask. And she'd actually listen to the answer. The first time she slipped me money, I was 11. She pressed a folded 20 into my palm in the hallway, glanced toward the kitchen where my mother was holding court, and said quietly, "For something that's just yours, don't put it toward this family. Put it toward you." I didn't understand the difference then. I do now. What I did with that first 20 and the ones that came after, 50s tucked into birthday cards, the occasional 100 rolled tight with a rubber band, was buy myself an education my parents didn't know I was getting. By the time I was 13, I bought a secondhand drafting set and a stack of architecture books, because somewhere in those library afternoons, I'd fallen in love with buildings. Not houses, exactly. Spaces. The way a room could make you feel small or safe or seen, depending on how the light came in. I'd lie on my floor and draw floor plans of places I wanted to live someday, places with big windows and a kitchen where a kid could eat cake. My mother found my drawings once. I'd left a folder on the kitchen table by accident. Orientation drawings, elevation sketches, a whole imaginary house I'd been working on for a month. She picked it up by one corner like it might be sticky, flipped through it, and said, "What is this nonsense? Dominic's got his real estate exam coming up, and you're scribbling. Useful would be helping your brother study." Then she dropped the folder in the trash on top of the coffee grounds. I dug it out after she went to bed. I wiped the coffee off with a paper towel, and I pressed the pages flat under my mattress, and I cried, quietly, the way you learn to cry in a house where crying gets you mocked. And then I kept drawing. Because here's the thing, nobody tells you about being the forgotten kid. Being invisible means nobody's watching you build the door you're going to walk out of. The door, when it came, had a name on it, a full scholarship to the College of Architecture at the University of Cincinnati. I was 17. I'd applied without telling anyone, used Aunt Marguerite's address for the mail so my mother wouldn't intercept it, and built the portfolio on a refurbished laptop I'd bought with 2 years of folded 20s. When the acceptance came, full ride, tuition, housing, a stipend for materials. Aunt Marguerite drove me to a diner to celebrate and ordered us both pie and watched me read the letter 4 times. I made the mistake of telling my family at dinner. I thought, in some small stupid part of me that still wanted them, that maybe this would be the thing. A full scholarship. To a real program. Maybe my mother would finally see. She set down her fork. "Cincinnati," she said. Like I'd announced I was moving to Mars. 3 hours away. "It's a full scholarship, Mom. The architecture program there is one of the best in the country. Dominic's getting his license this spring. He'll need help with showings, somebody to run the open houses while he builds his client base. Family helps family." She looked at my father. "Wendell, tell her she's not going." And my father, God help him, looked at his plate and said, "It's awful far, Sadie." That was it. That was his whole argument. It's awful far. I remember the heat coming up my neck. I remember saying, "It's my future, not Dominic's staffing problem." And my mother saying that my future was right here helping this family, and that if I walked out that door for some fantasy about drawing buildings, I'd be doing it alone. No money, no holidays, no coming back when it fell apart. She actually said, when, not if. I stood up so fast my chair tipped. "I've already accepted," I told her. "I did it 3 weeks ago." The silence in that kitchen was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. The weeks after that were a special kind of cold. My mother scheduled Dominic's study sessions during my shifts at the grocery store, so I'd have to choose between my paycheck and being the dutiful sister. She forgot to give me a phone message about my dorm move-in. She told relatives I was throwing my life away on a pipe dream. My father drove me to get my state ID renewed and said nothing the whole way, and when I asked him, quietly, if he thought I was making a mistake, he just turned up the radio. It was Aunt Marguerite who showed up the night before I left. She came to the back door after dark, the way she always did when my mother was around, and she pressed an envelope into my hands. Inside was a debit card and a slip of paper with a pin. $400 on there, she said. For the bus, for sheets, for whatever a girl needs the first month away from home, and Sadie. She held my face in both her papery hands. "You are not throwing anything away. You are picking it up. There's a difference, and someday they'll know it." I left at 5 in the morning. I'd called for a ride to the Greyhound station, couldn't afford to fly, didn't have a car. I carried one duffel bag and a portfolio case, and I stood at the end of the driveway in the dark watching the windows of that house, every one of them black. Nobody got up. Nobody said goodbye, except headlights swung onto the street, and it was Aunt Marguerite's Buick, and she rolled down the window and said, "You think I'd let you take a bus? Get in." She drove me herself. 3 hours in the dark with the heater rattling and an oldies station playing low. And at the station she hugged me so hard it hurt and said, "Go build something they can't ignore." I cried for the first 100 miles of that bus ride, and then I stopped, and I never really cried about them again. Cincinnati was hard in the way that good things are hard. The scholarship covered tuition and a dorm bed, but a stipend for materials does not cover food when you're a teenager with a fast metabolism and a $400 buffer that has to last. So I worked. I waited tables at a breakfast place near campus, the kind with sticky syrup dispensers and regulars who tipped in quarters, opening shifts at 5:30 so I could make my morning studio. Nights and weekends I worked the front desk at a self-storage facility on the edge of town, which was the best job I ever had because nobody ever came in after 9, and I could do my coursework behind the counter under a buzzing fluorescent light. Architecture school is a meat grinder. The all-nighters are real. I'd watch kids who'd come up easy, kids whose parents called every Sunday, kids who got care packages, break down crying over a model due at 8 a.m., and I felt this strange detachment because I'd been running on empty my whole life. There was nobody to call, there was nobody to disappoint but myself, and somehow, that made it lighter. The accident. Because there's always an accident, isn't there? The moment your life forks happened in my 3rd year, on a Tuesday in February, on the icy walk back from the studio at 2 in the morning. I'd been up for 30-some hours finishing a model, and I was carrying it in both arms, this delicate balsa wood thing I'd bled over for 2 weeks, and I hit a patch of black ice on the slope behind the engineering building and went down hard. The model exploded into kindling. My wrist took the full weight of the fall and snapped. I heard it, this wet green stick crack, and I lay there on the ice at 2 in the morning with my whole semester scattered around me in toothpick-sized pieces, and I genuinely thought, this is it. This is where I find out I can't do it alone. A guy heard me. He was crossing the lot to his car after his own all-nighter. A grad student in structural engineering named Theo Marchetti, though I didn't know any of that yet. He came running, and he didn't ask stupid questions. He just took off his scarf and made a sling, and got me to the campus ER in his rusted-out Corolla with the heater that didn't work. He stayed the whole time. He sat in the plastic chair while they x-rayed my wrist and said it. A clean break, thank God. And when the bill panic started rising in my throat, he said, "Student health covers it. Breathe." And he drove me back to my dorm at dawn and carried what was left of my model up the stairs, even though it was garbage now, because he said you don't just throw away 2 weeks of someone's life on the sidewalk. Theo started showing up after that. He'd appear at the studio with 2 coffees. He helped me rebuild the model with my good hand while the cast healed. He was quiet and precise and good in a way I didn't have a category for, because I'd never had a person just consistently show up before. The storage job let me go a few weeks later. Liability, they said, because of the cast, and the breakfast place cut my hours, and rent was a cliff I could see coming. Aunt Marguerite wired me $300 from her savings without my asking, just a text that said the money's there, don't argue. It bought me 2 months. It was Theo who first said the thing that changed everything. We were eating dollar pizza in the studio at midnight, both of us broke, and he was complaining about his thesis. Something about how mid-sized cities were full of dead buildings, old retail boxes and vacant strip malls and shuttered factories. Square footage just rotting while housing prices climbed. Somebody should figure out how to bring these back, he said. It's a structural problem and a design problem and nobody's looking at it together. And I, with my cast resting on the table and my whole life made of repurposing things people threw away, said, we could. That was the beginning of what became Reclamation Studio. It started as a thesis project and a stubborn idea that you could take the dead bones of a dying mall or an abandoned warehouse and design it into housing people could actually afford, and do it beautifully and do it profitably. Theo had the engineering. I had the design and, it turned out, the relentlessness. A bioscience student named Priyanka Dasgupta joined us. She ran numbers like breathing and understood financing and tax credits and the alphabet soup of historic preservation grants that nobody else wanted to read. We worked out of the basement of the architecture building first, then a borrowed garage, then a cramped office above the tattoo parlor and over the Rhine that we rented for almost nothing. Our first real project was a defunct department store downtown, a beautiful dead 1920s building the city had nearly condemned. We pitched a developer on converting it into mixed-income apartments, kept the bones, the big windows, the bones of the thing I'd have killed to live in as a kid. We layered in the financing Priyanka had found, the historic tax credits, the affordable housing offsets. The numbers worked. The developer said yes. Then it got featured in a regional architecture journal as a model for adaptive reuse. Then, a city in Indiana called. Then one in Kentucky. We weren't just designing anymore. We were licensing a method, a whole playbook for turning America's dead retail into living neighborhoods. We incorporated, we hired. The angel investor who got us our first real round had grown up in a town hollowed out when the mall closed, and he cried a little in the meeting, and he wrote the check. I'd be lying if I made it sound smooth. It wasn't. There were months I didn't take a salary. There was a near bankruptcy in year 2 when a deal collapsed and we made payroll on a credit card. But it worked, and then it more than worked. And one Tuesday morning, I opened my laptop to an email with a subject line that didn't feel real. A national business magazine, their annual list of innovators reshaping American cities. My name, my face, in a hard hat on one of our sites, grinning. Because I always grinned on a site, I couldn't help it. My mother had told me I'd be drawing buildings that nobody wanted. I was now redrawing entire downtowns. The money came in waves after that. A national real estate group made an offer to acquire our methodology and bring us in-house to run it at scale. An 8-figure deal, the kind of number that doesn't fit in your mouth when you try to say it out loud. Theo negotiated hard to protect our team, made sure every employee got equity. Priyanka modeled it 11 different ways. I signed the papers on a gray morning in a downtown conference room and walked out into the sun and bought a coffee and just stood on the sidewalk for a while, 28 years old, holding a paper cup, a millionaire several times over, completely calm. I paid off nothing because I'd never taken a loan. The scholarship had seen to that. So instead I bought my aunt a car. A real one. A new one. A Buick because she was loyal to them, and I had it delivered to her door with the bow on it. And she sent me a photo of herself standing next to it, grinning, captioned, "Your great aunt has arrived." I wired her enough that she'd never worry about a furnace breaking again. She tried to argue. I told her it was for something that was just hers. She got the reference. She cried. I bought a house too, eventually. Not in Toledo. God, no. I found it on a lake in northern Michigan. A long, low, modern thing with floor-to-ceiling windows and a kitchen the size of an apartment and a dining table. I had custom-built, solid walnut, 12 feet long, 10 chairs, no assigned seats, and no head of the table. I designed that house myself, every line of it, the house the 9-year-old on the floor of her bedroom in Toledo had been drawing all along. Big windows, room for everyone. A kitchen where a kid could absolutely have cake. Theo helped me move in. We weren't a couple, we'd tried, briefly, years before, and figured out we were better as the thing we actually were, which was family. He carried boxes and complained about the stairs and christened the kitchen by burning the first thing he cooked in it. Priyanka came up that first weekend with her husband and her toddler, who immediately smeared jam on the new walnut table, and I laughed so hard I had to sit down, because a kid had made a mess in my house and the only thing I felt was joy. That table saw things. It saw Thanksgivings, real ones, loud ones, with Theo carving and Priyanka's family taking over the kitchen and Aunt Marguerite at the head of it because she was the only person I'd ever let sit at the head of anything. It saw the neighbors, an older couple named the Hadleys who taught me to fish off the dock, and a single dad 2 houses down whose kids learned to swim in the summer off my boat lift. It saw board members and old professors and, once, my favorite librarian Imogen Frost, retired now, who drove up to see what the kid she'd handed all those books to had built. She stood in the great room with the light coming through the big windows, and she didn't say anything for a long minute. And then she said, "Well, look at the rooms you make people feel safe in now." And I had to leave to get more napkins so nobody would see my face. 8 years I didn't hear from my family. 8 years of clean, golden silence. I knew the broad strokes only because relatives talk. Dominic got his real estate license and then lost it. Something about commingling client funds. A lawsuit. A brief and ugly run. The house I grew up in went into foreclosure. My father retired, and my mother, I heard, told people her daughter was out east doing something with buildings in the vague, irritated tone of a woman who can't quite spin it into a story that makes her look good. And then the invitation came. Heavy cardstock. Gold foil, the works. My mother's 60th birthday, my old Toledo address crossed out, my Michigan one printed on a label, which meant someone had gone to the trouble of finding me. I held it for a long time on my dock, the lake flat as glass in the September morning. I told myself I wasn't going to go. And then I went because I think some part of me needed to see it with my own eyes, needed the door fully closed instead of just leaning shut. I flew into Toledo and rented a car and drove the old route. Past the high school, past the grocery store where I'd worked, past the breakfast place that was a vape shop now. The house I grew up in had new owners and a foreclosure sign still half stuck in the yard of the rental 2 doors down. The party was at a banquet hall by the highway, the kind with a fountain in the lobby and carpet the color of a bruise. I walked in wearing a blazer that cost more than my mother's monthly mortgage used to, and I watched the room recalibrate. There's a specific thing that happens when people who decided you were nothing realize you became something. The aunts I barely remembered descended. Dominic, heavier now, soft in the face, a watch on his wrist that I'd have bet money was a knockoff, pumped my hand and called me the big shot with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. My father hugged me too long and his eyes were wet and he said, "I read about you in the magazine." I kept it, and I didn't know what to do with that, so I did nothing. Then my mother took the microphone. She'd had a few glasses of wine. She did the toast every narcissist does. The one about family and sacrifice and how blessed she was. And then her eyes found me across the room and something curdled in her smile. And she said into the microphone in front of everyone, "And of course my daughter's here. Finally found time for us. Some children, you raise them and they decide they're too good for where they came from. But blood is blood. You can't ever really leave family behind." A few people laughed, uncertain. I felt the old heat climb my neck, and then, strangely, it cooled, because I realized I wasn't 9 anymore, eating bread at the counter. I was a woman who had walked out of the door she'd built with her own hands. I walked up to her calm, and I didn't take the microphone. I just spoke loud enough. "You're right," I said. "You can't really leave family behind." I let that sit a second. Which is why I want to thank Aunt Marguerite, who couldn't be here tonight, for being mine. She's the reason any of this exists. Everyone here who wondered where I went toward the people who actually showed up. The room went very quiet. My mother's face did something complicated. "As for blood," I said, quieter now, just for her. "You spent my whole childhood telling me which child made you proud. Congratulations. Your wish came true a long time ago. You don't have to see me every day. You don't have to see me at all." And I set down the water I'd been holding, and I walked out to the lobby with the ugly fountain, and I drove to the airport, and I flew home. My phone rang before the plane even taxied. My mother. Then a text. "We need to talk. You have money now. Family helps family." I read it twice. This woman who'd thrown my drawings in the coffee grounds, quoting her own gospel back at me now that I was the one with something to give. I blocked the number at the gate. Diamond tried a few weeks later. A voicemail about a short-term thing. Lawyer fees, a sure-thing deal he just needed seed money for. I deleted it without finishing. My father sent one email, forwarded clumsily from an old account. "Your mother is having a hard time. I'm sorry about all of it." I really am. And I sat with that one for a while because it was the most honest thing he'd ever sent me, 20 years too late. I didn't reply, but I didn't delete it either. I left it sitting in a folder. The apology I'd waited my whole childhood for finally arrived, weighing nothing. That December, I filled my house. The lake froze at the edges and the snow came down soft, and I strung lights along the dock and sent out invitations on cards I'd designed myself. Aunt Marguerite came first, of course, her Buick crunching up the drive, her trunk full of the pecan pie she'd been famous for my whole life. Theo came with too much wine. Priyanka's whole family came, the toddler now a kid who ran straight for the table like it was hers. The Hadleys came, and the single dad and his swimmers, and Imogen Frost in a cardigan, and Dr. Okonkwo, my old structures professor, who debated zoning policy until midnight like it was a blood sport. 10 chairs, all of them full. Halfway through dinner my phone buzzed. Unknown number, Toledo area code. I knew the rhythm of it by then. I silenced it and looked up at my table. Aunt Marguerite cutting the pie, the kids stealing a roll, Theo refilling glasses, the lake out the dark windows holding all the reflections like a second room, and I felt nothing I needed to answer. I stood up with my glass. I told them I'd started a foundation, named it after Aunt Marguerite. Full scholarships for kids whose families don't believe in them. Kids who get told they're throwing it away when they're actually picking it up. Aunt Marguerite put her napkin over her face. The room toasted, 10 glasses chiming over the walnut, and the single dad's daughter asked if she could apply someday, and I said absolutely, and the table erupted into plans the way startups do. Loud and overlapping and alive. Later, when everyone had gone and the lights were low, I sat alone at the head of that table with a cup of coffee going cold, and I thought about the 9-year-old folding white bread into a sandwich at a counter. Certain she was a number nobody was carrying. I wanted to reach back through all those years and tell her the truth I finally understood. Family isn't the people who happen to share your blood. Family is the table you build, and the chairs you fill, and the people who would never, not once, tell a child there's bread in the pantry while the cake is for someone else. I'd built my table. Every seat was taken. And not one of them belonged to anyone who'd ever made me feel like I had earned the right to sit down. For a long time, I believed the cruelest thing my mother ever did was the bread on the counter while the cake was for guests. I was wrong. The cruelest thing was teaching me, at 9 years old, that love was something you had to earn by being useful, and that I would never be useful enough. But here's what I understand now. Sitting at a table I built with my own 2 hands, every door she slammed forced me to learn how to build my own. Nothing in my life happened by accident. When my mother threw my drawings in the coffee grounds, she thought she was ending something. What she actually did was teach me that no one was coming to save my dreams, so I'd better learn to protect them myself. When my father said, "It's awful far," instead of standing up for me, he taught me that silence is its own kind of choice, and I promised myself I would never go quiet when someone I loved needed me loud. Every consequence in my story traces back to a cause. Dominic was handed everything, so he never learned to hold on to anything, and he lost it all. I was handed nothing, so I learned to make something out of nothing, and that skill became my whole life. If I could tell the 9-year-old folding bread at that counter just 3 things, it would be these. Keep your hands clean. When people are cruel to you, do not become cruel back, because the day my mother called begging for money, the thing that let me sleep at night was that I had never once stooped to who she was. Keep your mind hungry. Aunt Marguerite didn't just give me 20s, she gave me a reason to learn, and every book I read in that library was a brick in a wall they couldn't tear down. And keep going when it would be so much easier to stop. The night I broke my wrist on ice with my whole semester scattered around me. The only reason I'm here is that I got up. Falling was never the end. Staying down would have been. Aunt Marguerite used to say I wasn't throwing my life away, I was picking it up. She was right. The people who chose me, Theo, who made a sling out of his scarf at 2 in the morning, Marguerite, who drove 3 hours in the dark so I wouldn't ride a bus alone, they showed me what family actually is. It isn't the blood you're born into, it's the chairs you choose to fill. So fill them carefully. Be the person who would never tell a child there's bread in the pantry while the cake is for someone else. Build the table, and when the people who threw you away come back hungry, you'll already know the difference between the ones who showed up and the ones who only show up now.